Hey everybody, so it's been a couple of weeks since I last made a video, and so I kind of wanted to talk about a few things. I wanted to try something a little bit different this time. In the background you can see me building an amp. It's a Class 8 amplifier that I actually etched the board myself using ferric chloride, and I'll probably make a video on that at some point. During the process of making this amplifier, I do make a few mistakes that I rectify over the course of the build. And yeah, I just wanted to show this to you guys whilst I talk about stuff. So yeah, I could have absolutely went to Amazon or eBay or any other shop and just bought an amplifier. But I decided to build my own, and I did this for a variety of reasons. On my channel I like to make a point of DIY and getting people to be more involved in that sort of stuff. Aside from some niche cases, you don't really have control over where the components for electronic projects come from, because we still have an economy that's made up of centralized industry and it's controlled by large companies and such. But doing something like building your own amp instead of buying one, it gives you some admittedly superficial in this context self-sufficiency in terms of amplifiers. But again, baby steps, as they say. And there are people who have actually gone the extra mile and made their own components. You've seen people on Hackaday articles that basically make their own capacitors and resistors, and that's a step beyond what I can do now. But yeah, I'm all for that kind of stuff. I think the more we can chip away at the market economy and start to create our own alternatives in terms of things like production and goods that people can use, the more viable a transition into a different kind of system essentially becomes. And this is something I've highlighted in previous videos I've made. Even my mini short documentary that I made earlier this year, Seeds of Change. And when getting into DIY and all that sort of stuff, electronics is a pretty valuable skill to begin with, especially at something like an advanced level where you can start thinking about like home automation and stuff like that. That's a really good application of electronics in the context of becoming more self-sustaining. But me personally, I'm nowhere near that level yet. Plus, when you make your own electronics, it's open source hardware. And open source is something that's really important in terms of transitioning into post-scarcity. I guess you could frame self-sufficiency, DIY, sharing of local resources, engaging in local production and such, as essentially open sourcing the economy, like how people come together to create free software that others can contribute to, is called open source software. I think the open source concept, as I believe I've stated in the past, can be applied to a lot more stuff. But another point I wanted to make about self-sufficiency is that a lot of people have different ideas in their mind about what self-sufficiency means, and usually they imagine, some guy running into the forest and living off the land and eating berries and living in some wooden shack or whatever. I think this is quite a strict and unrealistic characterization of self-sufficiency. When I talk about self-sufficiency, what I'm really talking about is individuals and communities sustaining themselves through means that do not interact with the capitalist market system. They don't involve the use of money or trade or anything of that nature. If a individual or a community decides to buy a plot of land and dedicate it to being a vegetable garden or a greenhouse site or an orchard or something along those lines, where people could grow stuff either for themselves or for the community, and either themselves or others could take what they need. And even something as simple as that would be a small step towards decoupling either an individual or a community from the market system. Again, as an individual or community or network of people applies this to more and more stuff, that small piece grows into a significant chunk. And before you know it, you have a fully self-sustaining community or network of people that no longer rely on the capitalist market for their needs. And what this all is effectively a form of direct action. There's two main types of activism and advocating and bringing about change. and those are electoral politics and direct action. I'm not really a big fan of electoral politics. I think it's becoming increasingly ineffective. Most political parties around the globe are bought by big money interests, and any call for any change that would be positive for the vast majority of people or the planet is readily discarded. Thus, I'm not really interested in electoral politics because it's just not going to get us anywhere with the changes that need to happen to have a fruitful and sustainable future. Thus, when you talk to me about getting stuff done, I will overwhelmingly prefer direct action. However, I prefer some forms of direct action more than others. One method of direct action that I think I'm not necessarily opposed to, but I think is generally a waste of time, is the standard protest. Protests and demonstrations are very good at doing one thing, and that thing only, and that's galvanizing people. Protests and demos aren't really effective at doing much else. I mean, especially protests that call for government action, which is doomed to be ineffective to begin with, because most of the time any kind of protest that calls for action on part of the government is generally going to fall on deaf ears, because the state generally just isn't interested in people's needs, really. Not to mention that in some contexts, protesting is kind of a catch-22, because if you have a protest that doesn't disrupt anything, where people are just standing there passively, holding up picket signs, being quiet, not really doing much, then people are just going to walk by and not really take any interest. However, if a protest does cause a disruption, it generally ends up being basically framed by media in a negative light and generally just ends up angering people. And of course, being a Brit, I have to talk about Insulate Britain in this regard. If you don't know who Insulate Britain are, they're essentially a subset or a spin-off of Extinction Rebellion, which is an environmental organisation within this country. And they've been in the news a lot recently because of some of their actions during protest. I'm not too sure on the specifics, but as their name implies, they're basically calling on the government to do more in terms of home insulation and such in order to, reduce energy usage, reduce costs for people, that sort of thing. But when they've been doing demonstrations, they've been using protest tactics that have essentially angered the people that are supposed to be rooting for them. Essentially, they've been blocking off roads across the UK as a means of disruption, but it's basically just pissed people off, and it's basically gained them a lot of negative media attention as well. And if you take a look at interviews of Insulate Britain leaders, they don't really do much justice for their movement because they completely disregard problems within their organisation and within their demonstration tactics. Here's the thing. When Extinction Rebellion was standing on top of trains, stopping people from getting to work, I was perfectly fine with that. I thought that was a reasonable method of disruption. They weren't endangering anyone other than perhaps themselves. I mean, they're standing on top of a train. But aside from that, they weren't really affecting anyone in a significantly harmful way. However, there is something about blocking roads that can be uniquely harmful in today's context. Referring back to the example earlier with the Extinction Rebellion protest that disrupted train lines, when people are taking the train, they are either doing it for leisure or they're going to and from work. It is very unlikely that people are getting on a train for an emergency or to get to somewhere they need to be in short order. In contrast, on the road outside of rush hour, it is very likely that a lot of people on the road are either on the job or they need to get to somewhere quick, like if there is an emergency that they need to attend to. If there's people on the job that have somewhere to be because they need to meet a certain obligation or schedule, and there's demonstrations happening that block the road that they need to cross, and thus they can't meet those obligations, they could potentially lose their job. And then there's the emergencies aspect. Outside of the obvious things like firefighters and ambulances, people are going to be pretty ticked off if demonstrators stop them from witnessing the birth of their child or saying goodbye to a dying relative. And this is why people get angry when protesters like Insulate Britain do this. Now, as opposed to blocking roads and angering people, what do I think organisations like Insulate Britain should be doing? Well, they are an organisation, after all, and that means they have leverage. What I would like to see them do, instead of just calling on the government to do something about their cause, being insulation for homes and other buildings, I would actually like them to go a step further and partake in various effective forms of direct action. In Insulate Britain's case, I would like to see them be the change they want to see. I would like to see them crowdsource and, well, yes, we live in a monetary system now, unfortunately, so that means crowdfunding as well, so that they can go to people's homes and knock on doors and offer cheap or even free insulation installations. They could use funding and resources to train people up to do this kind of work, not as a form of charity, but as a form of solidarity, in addition to calling on the government to act, and say, hey, we are campaigning for better insulation across the country. We are leading by example by offering cheap or even free installations to people's homes. We are now calling on you, government, to pick up the slack on this, please. And you know what? They will have much better optics in doing that kind of thing. You know, instead of being seen as an annoyance that angers people, they'll be seen as a genuinely helpful organisation that people actually care about. If I was involved in politics, which I have no interest in, by the way, and I was like the leader of a Green Party or something like that, again, that's an organisation like with money, with resources that can actually do good. If I was in that position, I would be actively trying to do things that would further the green cause. I would hire like engineers to go to people's homes and offices and install things like solar panels on their roof and like geothermal heating and things like that. Because even though I'd be making a small contribution, that would be something actually being done about the problems that I care about. And in the same way that I would like to see green parties across the globe do this sort of thing, and in the same way I would like to see Insulate Britain, well, help insulate Britain, I get kind of frustrated by people who advocate for transitioning into a different kind of society, yet don't really do anything that contributes to their end. As I've said before, I don't really think that protest does much, nor is it really an effective method of direct action. And so the reason why I want more people to do more DIY and self-sufficiency and help cultivate alternative economies and all that kind of stuff is because that is real action. That's people trying their very hardest to build the world they want to see in the shell of the old world that currently exists now. I understand that some people don't really have the means to do this. That's fine. But if you do have the means, perhaps you could help those who don't. Perhaps they could be a beneficiary of the work that you do. But ultimately, if you want to create a freer, more equitable, more sustainable world, we have to start somewhere. Yes, raising awareness of issues is important, but raising awareness of solutions and actually acting on them solutions is something I think is much more meaningful and impactful. Anyway, that's my take. In the next video I'll show you how to etch boards. But for now, like, subscribe and share, take care, and have a good one.